Imagine a world where the richest subcontinent in human history was never looted, where the Mughal courts never fell to foreign mercenaries, where the weavers of Dhaka kept their thumbs, where the drain of $200 trillion never happened. South Asia in 1700 produced nearly a quarter of the entire world's economic output. What if it had simply been allowed to keep it? What kind of world would have been born? To understand what was lost, we must first understand what existed. In 1700, the Mughal Empire was the largest economy on Earth, producing roughly 24% of global GDP, more than all of Western Europe combined. The textile cities of Bengal wove fabrics so fine that European traders called them woven air. The ports of Surat and Calicut handled more annual trade tonnage than London and Amsterdam combined. This was not a developing civilization. This was the center of the world. The British East India Company arrived not as conquerors, but as supplicants. In 1608, Captain William Hawkins sailed to the Mughal court of Emperor Jahangir to beg for trading rights. Jahangir, who commanded an empire incomparably wealthier than England, initially dismissed him. The company's first century in India was one of cautious trading posts, humiliating rejections, and total dependence on Mughal goodwill. The transformation from merchant to master happened so gradually that most Indians did not see it coming until it was too late. The moment everything changed was June 23, 1757. The Battle of Plassey. The Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, faced Robert Clive's company army with a force nearly 10 times larger. But Mir Jafar, his general, had been bribed. 2/3 of the Nawab's army stood still and watched. In less than 8 hours, Bengal, the richest province in Asia, was delivered to a trading company headquartered in London. Plassey was not a battle, it was a transaction, sir. Our point of divergence. What if Mir Jafar's bribe was discovered 1 week before Plassey? What if Siraj-ud-Dowlah, warned by a loyal officer, had Mir Jafar arrested, promoted a competent general in his place, and met Clive with his full force? The historical military calculus is clear. 10-to-1 odds with functioning artillery and loyal cavalry would have annihilated the company force. Clive captured, the company expelled from Bengal, and the British presence in India reduced to a handful of coastal trading forts with no political power whatsoever. Without the fall of Bengal, the company's model collapses. Its entire strategy depended on using Bengal's enormous tax revenues to fund further military conquests across the subcontinent. Without that financial engine, it remains what it always claimed to be: a trading company. The British government, unwilling to fund a military occupation from London, confines British presence to Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta as treaty ports. South Asia, for the first time in centuries, is left to determine its own political future. Into this space steps the Maratha Confederacy. By 1760, the Marathas already controlled most of central and western India and were the dominant military power on the subcontinent. In our timeline, they were eventually broken by the British. In this alternate world, with no British threat from Bengal, the Maratha Peshwas spend the next 3 decades consolidating a pan-Indian confederate state. Not an empire, but a sophisticated federal system in which regional kingdoms maintain autonomy under Maratha military protection and shared judicial codes. Trade, unburdened by colonial extraction, compounds at extraordinary rates. Bengal's textile industry, which in our history was deliberately destroyed by British trade policy, that cut off the thumbs of skilled weavers and flooded Indian markets with cheap machine-made cloth, instead becomes the engine of South Asian industrialization. By 1820, Dhaka has its own power looms. By 1840, Bombay has a steam-powered port. The Industrial Revolution in this alternate timeline does not belong exclusively to Britain. It is a race, and South Asia enters it from a position of enormous accumulated wealth. The global trade map is redrawn entirely. In our history, Britain used India as both a captive market and a source of raw materials. Cotton went to Manchester mills and came back as finished cloth at prices that destroyed Indian weavers. In this alternate world, the finished goods flow in the opposite direction. South Asian textiles, steel and spices move through Omani, Persian, and independent Indian merchant networks that answer to no European colonial power. The terms of global trade in the 19th century are set not in London, but in Bombay and Calcutta. The consequences for the rest of Asia are profound. In our history, Britain used India as a staging ground for the colonization of Burma, Malaya, Singapore, and Hong Kong. And as the source of the opium, it forced China to buy at gunpoint. In this alternate world, none of those dominoes fall. Burma remains the Compound Kingdom, Malaya's sultanates maintain sovereignty, and China, never subjected to the Opium Wars, never suffers the century of humiliation that scarred its national psychology for 150 years. The African continent is transformed as well. Britain's ability to colonize Africa in the 19th century depended almost entirely on Indian soldiers, Indian administrative infrastructure, and Indian tax revenues. The scramble for Africa, in which European powers carved up the entire continent at the 1885 Berlin Conference, required the logistics of a global empire headquartered in India. Without an Indian empire to draw on, Britain is simply a mid-sized European power. The Berlin Conference either never happens or produces a very different map. Within South Asia itself, the social consequences of non-colonization reshape every dimension of life. The caste system, which the British codified, hardened and weaponized as a tool of administrative control, remains the fluid, regionally varied social practice it had always been, subject to reform movements from within rather than exploitation from without. The reform movements of the 19th century, figures like Ram Mohan Roy, Jyotirao Phule, Savitribai Phule, emerge in a context of indigenous political agency rather than colonial response, and their ideas carry far more power in a self-governing society. By the 20th century, the divergence has compounded into an almost unrecognizable world. South Asia, never drained of an estimated $45 trillion in wealth, historian Utsa Patnaik's calculation for colonial extraction, enters the 1900s as one of the world's 2 or 3 great industrial powers. Its railway network, built for internal commerce rather than colonial extraction, connects every major city. Its universities, funded by indigenous wealth rather than colonial charity, produce scientists, engineers, and philosophers who sit at the forefront of global knowledge. There is no partition. The catastrophic division of 1947, in which the British drew a hasty line through the Punjab and Bengal in 6 weeks, triggering one of the largest forced migrations in human history and leaving wounds that still bleed today, simply never happens. South Asia's political evolution, guided by its own reform movements, federal experiments, and indigenous democratic traditions, produces a different map, not necessarily one unified state, but boundaries drawn by negotiation and cultural geography, rather than by a British civil servant with a ruler and a 6-week deadline. The English language does not dominate the world in this alternate timeline. In our history, English became the global lingua franca through British imperial reach and then American economic hegemony, itself built substantially on the profits of the British Empire. In this alternate world, South Asia's commercial dominance produces a different global language hierarchy. Hindi-Urdu, already spoken by more people than any other language in 1700, continues to spread along South Asian trade routes. Sanskrit-derived academic traditions influence global scholarship. The world's dictionaries look very different. The cities of South Asia in this alternate 20th century look nothing like the ones we know. Without colonial urban planning that segregated natives from Europeans, without the deliberate underfunding of indigenous infrastructure, without the neglect of ancient irrigation networks that caused the famines that killed 30 million people under British rule, the subcontinent's cities have grown on their own terms. Delhi, Lahore, Dhaka, Hyderabad and Madras are among the world's great metropolises. Their skylines a confident fusion of classical Indian architecture and modern industrial design. The question of democracy takes a different shape. South Asia's indigenous political traditions, the Gram Sabha village councils, the Jain and Buddhist ethical frameworks, the sophisticated Artha Shastra traditions of statecraft, the consultative traditions of the Maratha Confederacy were not destroyed and replaced by Westminster parliamentary models. Instead, they evolved organically, producing governance systems that blend participatory local democracy with sophisticated federal structures. Not better or worse than Westminster, different and genuinely rooted in the civilizations that created them. Science and medicine flourish in ways our world only glimpsed. The mathematical traditions of Kerala, which independently developed many concepts of calculus before Newton and which were being actively developed in the 16th and 17th centuries, are not interrupted by colonial disruption of indigenous scholarly institutions. Ayurvedic medicine, evolving alongside rather than being suppressed by Western biomedicine, develops empirical research traditions of its own. By the mid-20th century of this alternate world, South Asian contributions to physics, mathematics and medicine rival those of any civilization on Earth. Here is the staggering conclusion. Historian Angus Maddison's data shows that South Asia's share of global GDP fell from 24% in 1700 to less than 4% by 1950. One of the most catastrophic economic collapses in human history, achieved not by war or plague, but by deliberate policy. In this alternate world, if that wealth had simply compounded at modest historical growth rates, South Asia's economy in 2024 would be larger than the United States and China combined. The poverty of the modern subcontinent is not ancient. It was manufactured, and it could have been otherwise. What colonialism teaches us, even examined from the distance of history, is that poverty is not destiny. The subcontinent that built the Taj Mahal, that produced algebra and chess and the decimal system, that wove cloth so fine it was called moonlight, that civilization did not fail. It was interrupted. The question for our time is whether that interruption can be undone, whether the compounding can begin again, whether the world can recover what was taken. Follow Altered Empires for more history that will rewire your brain.